When did you realize you were getting the short end of the stick? My fourth miscarriage ended with the doctor saying getting pregnant again would kill me. When I broke down at my parents' house, my sister Hazel held me and said, "I'll carry your baby. You've always been there for me. Please let me be there for you." 3 months later, the IVF transfer worked, and Hazel was pregnant with our daughter. She made the decision to move into our apartment because the baby needs all my focus. She turned down a promotion at work that would have doubled her salary because it required travel. When her best friends planned a Vegas trip for her birthday, she stayed home saying, "Isabella's baby is more important than any party." My mom said she'd never seen Hazel so dedicated to anything, and honestly, neither had I. At 37 weeks, Hazel called from the hospital saying the baby was coming early. We rushed there, but when we got to her room, she wouldn't let me in and kept saying, "I need to focus. This is really hard for me," which made no sense because we'd planned for me to be there. After 12 hours waiting in the hallway, a nurse finally came out and said I could see my daughter, but when I walked in and asked Hazel if I could hold her, she screamed, "Don't touch my baby!" I thought she was exhausted and confused, but then she pulled the baby tighter and said, "I can't give her up, she's mine, I felt her grow." My mind couldn't process what was happening until she looked at me with this cold expression and said, "You always got everything. Perfect grades, perfect husband, perfect friends, but this baby chose me to be her mother." My legs gave out and I started sobbing when she said, "Maybe God took your babies because he knew I was meant to be her mother." My husband just held me as I cried. When my parents arrived, I thought they'd help, but mom actually took Hazel's side saying, "She carried that child for 9 months, you can't just take her baby." I ended up on my knees begging my little sister, and she looked down at me like I was nothing and said, "I'm saving my daughter from being raised by someone who can't even carry a child." Hazel left the hospital with my daughter, and my parents took her to their house where they wouldn't let us inside. When we called our lawyer, she explained that without a surrogacy contract, the biological mother had all the rights. We spent days begging at my parents' door, but they'd call the police if we didn't leave, so we started parking outside just to catch a glimpse of our daughter through the windows. After a week of this, I was ready to give up, but then Hazel's high school best friend contacted me out of nowhere, saying she had something important to share. She showed me Instagram messages where Hazel had told multiple people, "I'm only agreeing to this so I can finally have something Isabella wants," and screenshots of Hazel asking her cousin who's a paralegal about biological mother rights and surrogacy cases 3 months before she even offered to help us. She also had texts from 2 weeks after the birth where Hazel admitted she'd been too overwhelmed to handle this and had left the baby with my parents for days while she went partying. When child services investigated, they found Hazel had left the hospital without the car seat we'd bought and had been driving around with my daughter loose in the backseat, plus she'd missed 3 pediatrician appointments. The judge said that while the fraud was concerning, it was the child endangerment and abandonment that made Hazel an unfit parent and granted us emergency custody. When they handed me my daughter, Hazel said, "She'll always know deep down that you're not her real mother." 6 months later, I was finally starting to feel normal again when Hazel showed up at my door looking like death warmed over. She told me her boyfriend had left her after finding out what she'd done to me because apparently he couldn't trust someone who would steal their own sister's baby. Then she started crying and said she'd had an ectopic pregnancy that ruptured and they had to remove both her tubes during emergency surgery. So now she could never have biological children. She stood there on my porch sobbing and said, "I just want to see her one time. I carried her for 9 months. Please, Isabella, I have no one left." I looked at her and felt absolutely nothing when I said, "I had no one when you stole her and told me I wasn't a real woman. So now you get to know exactly how that feels." My daughter came running up behind me yelling, "Mommy, mommy, look what I drew," and looked right through Hazel like she was a stranger at the door trying to sell something. I picked up my baby and closed the door on my sister, who was still standing there sobbing about how unfair life was, which was pretty ironic considering she'd told me God took my babies for a reason.